People often misunderstand silence. They think it's neutral, that it's empty, that it's some kind of passive absence. But in many cases, especially in relationships that end in emotional confusion, silence is anything but passive. It's often deliberate, intentional. A calculated maneuver, not just to process, but to control. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse it for closure when, in reality, it's a test of power. When she goes quiet right after things fall apart, it's rarely because she's indifferent. Indifference doesn't need strategy. Indifference walks away and never looks back. But silence, true strategic. Silence leaves space just wide enough for uncertainty to live. It forces you to wonder, it keeps the loop open. And that's not accidental, that's the game, because if she really wanted to close the chapter, she would say the words she would. Communicate clarity. But instead what you get is ambiguity disguised as peace. You see, after a relationship especially, one where emotions ran high, where validation was part of the currency exchanged, people don't always walk away cleanly. They leave traces, not physical ones, but emotional breadcrumbs. And when she goes silent without resolution, without accountability, without even a hint of emotional closure, it's not usually about healing. It's about keeping the tension alive without having to manage it directly. It's about seeing if you'll come knocking again, because if you do, she wins, not in the sense of reconciliation, but in power, in emotional leverage, in knowing that even in her absence, she still owns a piece of your attention. The silence becomes bait, but it doesn't look like bait. It looks like strength. It looks like growth. It looks like someone who's moved on. But behind it, there's often an expectation that you'll reach out, that you'll be the one to bridge the gap. Why? Because you always have, because you were the emotionally available one, because you were the one willing to talk things through even after being hurt. And she knows that, so she uses it. She hides behind the wall of non-communication, knowing you're the one more likely to break. And the danger in this is that you can start to question your own healing. You start to think, maybe I should reach out, not because you want to re-enter the understanding women's emotional signals cycle of dysfunction, but because silence naturally creates a vacuum that the human mind wants to fill. We are narrative-driven creatures. When we don't have an ending, we go looking for one. But in these cases, that's exactly the trap. The silence isn't there to help you close the story. It's there to keep you rereading the last chapter. When someone has grown accustomed to being the emotional center of your world, they don't release that role easily. Even after a breakup, they still expect you to circle back to affirm that they still matter. Even in absence, they don't say it. Of course, that would break the illusion of strength. But the silence speaks on their behalf. It whispers the question, do I still have your attention? And if you answer it, if you reach out, you've just handed back the emotional leverage they feared losing. So this is where discernment becomes critical. You have to ask yourself, is her silence healing, or is it control? Is it rooted in self-reflection, or is it a calculated way to see if I'm still under her influence? Because one leads to peace and the other keeps you locked in a cycle of emotional ambiguity. And you can't grow there. You can't rebuild in that space. You can't reclaim your identity when you're still measuring your worth by how long you can endure her absence. What's even more insidious about this kind of silence is that it cloaks itself in dignity. It's hard to call out manipulation when there are no words, but emotional control doesn't always need volume. Sometimes it's the quiet withholding of validation that keeps you entangled. The unanswered message, the ignored call, the refusal to acknowledge your emotional labor. All of that, though, unspoken screams of control, and yet many men interpret this as a sign of maturity. They think, well, maybe she just needs space. Maybe she's healing too, and that could be true. Healing brings peace, not confusion. It brings acceptance, not games. So if her silence feels more like a test than a transition, you're not dealing with growth. You're dealing with control dressed in restraint. You'll know you're breaking free when her silence no longer bothers you. When you stop checking, stop wondering, stop hoping for a sign, that's when the balance shifts. It's when you reclaim the power that was always yours, but that you kept outsourcing to someone who thrived on your emotional availability. Don't chase the silence. Don't respond to the bait. Let her wait, because when silence is used as a trap, the only way to win is not to play. You might think that once someone's gone silent, the story ends there, but it rarely does. In reality, many people don't disappear completely. They just shift strategies when someone wants to maintain emotional influence without exposing themselves to rejection or vulnerability. They resort to indirect communication. It's a quieter form of control, but it's just as powerful, and sometimes even more dangerous because it's disguised as coincidence or as nothing at all. But it's not nothing. It's calculated. It's designed to get your attention without ever risking the dignity of reaching out directly. You'll start noticing little things, a post that seems just a little too personal, a picture that highlights something you used to talk about, a quote that mirrors mixed signals versus hidden hope, an old conversation or an inside joke. Most people wouldn't catch it, but you do, because it's meant for you. That's the trick. It's indirect on the surface, but highly personal underneath. These aren't random actions, they're signals. It's like a breadcrumb trail, only it doesn't lead back to her. Not exactly. Leads to a place of emotional confusion, where she still holds the cards, and you're left trying to decode the message. And this is where it gets tricky, because if you call it out, if you confront it, you look paranoid. You look like you're reading too much into things. It was just a post. She might say you're overthinking. You know better. You know that energy doesn't lie. You know that timing isn't random. Don't suddenly start talking about the exact thing you used to fight over, unless they're trying to stir the waters. They want to trigger something in you, a reaction, an emotion, a return. So what do most men do? They take the bait, they respond, they reach out, and just like that, she gets what she wanted. Validation that she's still relevant. She doesn't even have to say it. She doesn't have to risk rejection, she sends. The signal, you respond, and the dynamic remains intact. You're still orbiting her emotional world, even after everything supposedly ended. But you've got to learn to see through this. You've got to understand the deeper pattern. This is about power, not love, not healing, not growth. About who gets to control the rhythm of the emotional aftermath. And as long as she can send out vague signals and get a clear emotional reaction from you, she remains in control. Now think about how this affects your healing. You're trying to move on. You're trying to build something real within yourself. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you get these emotional flare-ups, moments that stir the past, that drag you back into memories you were trying to bury. That's not accidental. That's emotional disruption disguised as nostalgia, and it derails your progress because it forces you to re-engage with something you were starting to detach from. She knows that reaching out directly might push you further away or make her look desperate, so instead she uses ambiguity. It's safe. It lets her appear strong and composed while still tugging on the threads of your attention. She can deny it all if she needs to, and that plausible deniability gives her power. Meanwhile, you're the one sitting there wondering what it means, what she wants, what you should do. You need to understand something very clearly. Communication isn't only verbal. Energy is communication. Timing is communication. Intention is communication. And when someone keeps showing up in indirect ways, just enough to stir your emotions but not enough to resolve anything, what they're really doing is keeping you on a leash. You're not free. You're just unspoken for. And that's not healing. That's captivity. So what do? You stop reacting. You stop validating signals that aren't honest. You stop giving your energy to a communication style that lacks the courage of when to wait versus when to reach out. Transparency. Because here's the truth. Anyone who genuinely wants to be in your life will make it clear. They won't play games. They won't drop hints and hope you decode them like some emotional scavenger hunt. They will show up directly with clarity, with intention, and that's what you deserve. Not emotional breadcrumbs, not confusing messages, not someone trying to manipulate your attention without offering their own vulnerability. You deserve someone who isn't afraid to say what they feel, someone who respects your healing journey enough to either be honest or stay away. But this in-between space, this manipulative, half-present energy, it's a trap, a beautifully disguised trap, designed to keep you emotionally dependent without her ever having to be accountable. Don't give in to the temptation of those signals. Don't confuse indirect attention with love, because love doesn't hide behind subtweets and old memories. It stands in the light, and if she won't meet you there, then let her stay in the shadows. One of the most telling signs that she's waiting for you to reach out is the sudden shift in her energy. Once she realizes you're no longer chasing. First, it might feel like everything's over, like the distance between you has solidified into silent, and that silence can be deafening. But here's what happens next, and it's predictable if you have seen it before. The moment she senses that your emotional energy is no longer revolving around her, when she truly begins to feel the absence of your pursuit. That's when the panic begins to rise beneath her calm exterior. You see, during the relationship or even the situationship, there's often a dynamic where one person becomes the emotional center and the other, often the man, becomes the responder, the fixer, the one who reaches out first, apologizes first, checks in first. She gets used to that rhythm. It reinforces her sense of importance, her sense of control, her perceived value in your life. It tells her, no matter how far I push, he'll come closer. No matter how silent I get, he'll fill the space. And as long as you do, she never has to doubt her position. But healing is disruptive to that system when you start to pull your energy back, not out of spite, but out of necessity. She feels it, even if there's no contact, even if there's no signal from your end. She senses the shift, because when a man starts healing, his energy changes. He becomes less reactive, less emotionally available, and that absence speaks louder than any words ever could. And so the panic starts to show, but never directly. It's subtle. You might start noticing she's suddenly more visible, more active, sharing more, posting things that feel strangely performative. And it's not for the world, it's for you. It's a way to say, look, I'm fine without you, while secretly hoping you'll see it and feel something. It's an emotional flare shot into the sky, designed to look like confidence, but rooted in fear. Why fear? Because when you stop chasing, it forces her to confront a reality she's been avoiding, that you were the one investing more, that your love wasn't weak, it was rare, that the very things she took for granted are the same things she now realizes aren't so easy to replace. And that's terrifying, because it means she miscalculated. She thought she had more time, more influence. She thought the door would always be cracked open just enough, but now for the first time she sees it closing. And what that reveals, perhaps more than anything, is that your value was never invisible. It was just ignored. And now, with your silence, your boundaries, your refusal to play the same emotional games, she's forced to feel the absence of something she never fully appreciated. That's what healing does. It doesn't just protect you, it reflects you. It becomes a mirror that shows other people who you were all along, once you stop trying to prove it. This is why you can rush back in, no matter how strong the temptation might be, because the panic she's feeling. Now, that's not regret, that's withdrawal. It's not that she's ready to love you better. It's that she's no longer being fed by your attention. And there's a big difference between the timing she's hoping for. Someone who wants you back and someone who wants the feeling of being wanted again. One is about you, the other is about them, and that's where men often go wrong. They misinterpret that shift. They see her resurface and think it means she's realized something profound. Sometimes she has, but often it's just discomfort. She misses the safety of being admired, the comfort of your consistency, but missing that doesn't mean she's suddenly ready to match your depth. It doesn't mean she's done the work. It just means the silence you left behind got louder than she expected. So now the test is yours. Do you break the silence because she's uncomfortable, or do you respect your own healing enough to stay the course? That decision defines everything, because when you choose not to respond to someone else's panic and instead remain rooted in your own peace, you take back the power that was once scattered across every apology, every message, every emotional plea. You begin to lead with dignity instead of desperation. And ironically, that's when your value becomes undeniable, not just to her, but to yourself. That's when you start to realize that your worth was never determined by her reaction. It was always determined by your ability to walk away when staying meant losing yourself. The moment she realizes you're no longer chasing is the moment she has to face who she is without your energy and who you've become without her control. Something interesting happens when you stop seeking closure and start finding clarity on your own. It shifts the entire emotional equation. Up until that moment she's been banking on. The fact that you'll keep circling back, asking questions, trying to understand, trying to fix what went wrong, because that's what people do when they haven't healed yet. They stay in the loop, hoping for some kind of resolution, some perfect conversation that finally makes it all make sense, and that gives her a sense of control. As long as you're still seeking, she still matters. But healing, real healing, breaks that loop. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's quiet and internal and hard-won. It's the slow rebuilding of your self-respect. It's the realization that you don't need her permission to let go, that you don't need her acknowledgement to move forward. And when you reach that place, when you no longer chase closure, because you have built peace within yourself, something shifts in her, not just emotionally, but psychologically. She can feel that the grip she once had is slipping. She can feel that you're no longer emotionally tethered to the outcome and to someone who is relying on your emotional dependency to feed her sense of importance. That's deeply unsettling, because people don't panic when you leave, they panic when they realize you are not coming back, when they sense that something fundamental in you has changed: your tone, your boundaries, your silence. It unsettles them in ways they don't expect, and that panic won't always look like desperation. Sometimes it looks like indifference or sudden coldness or silence that feels strategic, but underneath it is the realization that you're not seeking anything from her anymore. Not clarity, not comfort, not validation. That's when she realizes you're no longer orbiting her. You've stepped out of the emotional field entirely. What you begin to understand at this point is that closure was never hers to give, and maybe she never intended to give it. Maybe she used ambiguity to maintain just enough confusion. So you'd always keep wondering that uncertainty. It was a form of control. As long as you stayed in that space of emotional ambiguity, she remained relevant in your psyche. You couldn't move on fully because the story was still open-ended. But when you stopped needing her to explain why she hurt you, why she left, why she changed, when you stopped needing those explanations to validate your experience, that's when you truly begin to heal. And when that healing becomes visible, when why you shouldn't to rush or chase, it starts to show up in your posture, in your words, in your decisions, in your absence. That's when she begins to feel the loss. Because up until that point, you were predictable. She knew how you'd react. She knew that if she pulled away, you'd come closer. If she stayed silent, you'd reach out. If she gave half of her attention, you offered twice as much. That predictability gave her comfort, even if she had no intention of matching your effort. But healing strips that predictability away. Suddenly, she doesn't know how to reach you anymore, because you're no longer emotionally accessible to the same tactics. And here's what's important. That doesn't make you cold or bitter. It makes you whole. You're not withholding love. You're withdrawing from a pattern that cost you too much. You're not punishing her with silence. You're protecting yourself from a cycle that only led to confusion and depletion. He stopped seeking peace in a place that only offered chaos. And that is a radical act of self-respect. People often misunderstand what closure actually is. They think it's a conversation, a moment, a final message. Most of the time, closure is a realization. It's the quiet acceptance that you won't ever get the apology you deserved. It's understanding that the way someone treated you had more to do with them than it ever did with your worth. And once you see that clearly, you no longer need answers, you just need space to grow. That's when she starts watching more closely. That's when she checks in silently, passively, wondering what you're doing, who you're becoming, why you no longer need what you once begged for. And in that confusion, she has to sit with the reality that she was never the source of your worth. She was just a chapter in the story of you learning how to see it. And when that truth lands, when it's no longer just an idea but a felt experience, you walk away differently. Not with bitterness, not with revenge in your heart, but with a clarity so strong that it no longer needs to prove itself to anyone, not even to her. She panics when you stop seeking closure because she realizes you found something far more powerful, yourself. There's a moment in healing that often goes unnoticed because it doesn't come with fireworks or some grand epiphany. It's quieter than that, more personal. It's when you stop reacting, when you stop watching, checking, wondering what she's thinking, what she's posting, what she might be saying indirectly. That moment when your emotional investment withdraws from her world and returns to your own is the very moment she begins to feel your absence in a way she can't ignore, because until then, even in your silence, you were still energetically present. Your attention still lingered. And people can feel that. You have to understand something fundamental. Most people don't realize they're being supported by your emotional energy until it's gone. They don't notice the weight of your love, your patience, your forgiveness, your checking in until they feel the vacuum left behind. And that vacuum is powerful. It doesn't scream, it echoes. That's what she starts to feel once you stop reacting. It used to be predictable. Your silence had an expiration date. Your distance was a strategy one you didn't fully commit to. Maybe it lasted a few days, maybe a week. But eventually she knew you. Come back. She counted on your need for reconciliation, for clarity, for maintaining your masculine frame connection. She knew that even if she pushed you away, your heart would eventually override your pride that gave her a sense of certainty. Not love necessarily, but control, security, and security in a dynamic she didn't have to nurture. But healing dismantles that pattern. Because healing isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about getting so honest with yourself that your former patterns begin to feel foreign. You don't want to play those emotional games anymore, not because you've become indifferent, but because you've finally seen the cost, and that cost is too high. The cost of overextending yourself for someone who only meets you halfway, the cost of living in emotional limbo, waiting for crumbs of validation, the cost of betraying your own standards just to feel needed. So you begin to respond differently, or more accurately, you stop responding at all. You don't chase, you don't argue, you don't engage in the subtle back and forth that wants to find your connection, not out of bitterness, but because your energy has found a better place to land yourself. And this shift doesn't go unnoticed. She feels it even if she doesn't say it. There's a strange irony in that the less you react, the more visible your absence becomes. It's no longer about what you say or do, it's about what you don't say, what you don't give attention to. She'll start to test it subtly, indirectly. Maybe she'll post something that she knows would have drawn a reaction before. Maybe she'll bring up something from your past, masked as a joke or a memory. Maybe she'll reach out under the pretense of concern just to gauge your emotional availability, but your lack of engagement, your peaceful distance, sends a louder message than any argument ever could. And that message is clear. You've moved on from the need to be understood by someone who was never really listening. You've moved on from needing acknowledgement from someone who never knew what to do with your vulnerability in the first place. You're not angry. You're not playing hard to get. You're just done giving your energy to someone who didn't protect it. That level of clarity is disarming because it doesn't come with an emotional flare-up. It doesn't give her the satisfaction of being the center of your storm. It just removes her from the equation. And for someone who was used to being your emotional priority, that's unsettling. She doesn't know where she stands anymore. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become self-contained. You stop explaining yourself. You stop seeking closure. You stop needing her to validate your worth, and that self-possession, it's a mirror she wasn't ready to look into because it forces her to confront what she lost. Not a man who chased her, not someone desperate for attention, but someone who cared deeply, who gave fully, and who despite everything was willing to walk away once he realized his effort wasn't being met. That kind of realization doesn't land all at once. It creeps in slowly. It shows up when she expects you to react and you don't, when she posts something provocative and you remain silent, when she sends a message and you don't answer, or you answer with calm detachment. It's in those moments she starts to realize that what you once offered, your presence, your heart, your loyalty, wasn't just available by default. It was a gift. And it's no longer hers. And that's what people fear most. Not your anger, not your withdrawal, but your indifference. Because when you no longer react, when you no longer respond, it's clear that your healing is no longer about her. It's about reclaiming your life, your peace, your future. He panics not because you left, but because she can finally feel that you're not looking back. One of the most telling signs that healing has taken root in your life is when your presence no longer revolves around proving your worth to someone who once took it for granted. It's when your silence isn't about punishing anyone. It's simply because you no longer need to be heard by those who never really listen. That shift, that quiet internal movement speaks volumes. And ironically, it's often the very moment she begins to feel the weight of what she dismissed. You see, when you were broken, when you were fragmented, there was still this lingering desire to be seen by her, to be understood, maybe even redeemed in her eyes. And that energy, whether you realized it or not, kept a tether between you two. It wasn't at hope exactly, but a kind of emotional dependence on being acknowledged. It's a vulnerable place to be because your healing is still tied to her recognition of your pain. You still want her to understand the depth of what you felt, maybe to regret it, maybe to admit that she mishandled you, but that's not real healing. That's just wounded pride wearing a mask. Healing detaches you from that need entirely. You don't need her to get it anymore. You don't need her to feel what you felt to suddenly have an awakening and say, Jose, you were right. I was wrong. You stop needing closure from a person who was never capable of giving it in the first place. That's when the energy shifts not out of spite, but out of wisdom. You've seen enough, felt enough. If she's waiting, this will trigger her given enough. And now the only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. And here's the paradox: when you no longer care whether she gets it or not, that's often the moment she starts to, because the emotional dynamic flips. You're no longer orbiting around her waiting for acknowledgement. Standing still, you've anchored yourself in self-respect, and from her vantage point, that stillness is jarring because it's not indifference born from anger. It's presence born from clarity. People notice when the energy changes. She may not have noticed your love when it was consistent and overflowing, but she notices the void it leaves behind. She may not have recognized the little ways you showed up, the messages you sent, the patience you extended, but she notices when all of it stops, not with noise, not with bitterness, but with a calm that says, I've outgrown this. That kind of calm can't be faked. You can't simulate peace. You either have it or you don't, and when you do, it radiates, it changes your tone, your body language, the way you move through the world. It's not something you project to prove you're over someone. It just exists because you've reclaimed all the parts of yourself that you gave away too cheaply. And when she senses that it triggers something, she may not be ready to face regret. Doesn't always show up loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly in the moments she expected you to reach out and you didn't. In the silence she thought was temporary, now stretching into permanence. She doesn't say it, but she feels it, that she was part of your story but not your final chapter, that she held your heart but not your future. What begins as panic in her often ends as reflection, because your healing isn't just about letting go, it's about becoming someone she could no longer access in the same way, not because you're punishing her, but because you finally placed boundaries where once there were none. And those boundaries aren't walls, they're standards. You don't keep people out to hurt them. You protect your peace because you finally understand how valuable it is, and this evolution is terrifying. To someone who never expected you to change, who thought they could always circle back, always find you waiting, but you're not the same man she left behind you. You're not the same person who tolerated mixed signals, emotional distance, or half-hearted affection. You've healed into someone who won't abandon himself just to keep someone else close. And that kind of growth is confronting. She may try to reconnect, not out of love necessarily, but out of familiarity, out of the discomfort she feels when she realizes you're no longer emotionally available, not in the way you were before, but your healing teaches you something vital. Not every invitation deserves a response, not every apology is sincere, and not every reappearance means she's changed. Sometimes it just means she misses the final words, strength and stillness version of you that didn't know his worth yet. And that's the final test, isn't it, to respond to the reappearance with the same clarity that brought you peace in the first place, to recognize that just because she feels your absence now doesn't mean she's ready to honor your presence. That's where true healing lives. Not in getting them back, but in never needing them again. Because when you've truly healed, you don't move forward with resentment. You move forward with resolve.